We talked about how, as of January 1945, that on the east, the Russians were approaching Germany, and on the west, the British and the Americans are. And it had become a race for Berlin. Berlin starts to be taken in April of 1945. On the outskirts of the town, the soldiers are fighting, and the result ends up being pretty catastrophic for Berlin. You can see here the Reichstag, just regular streets in Berlin. This will play a role in the Cold War when Berlin really is desperate and devastated and will need to completely rebuild. One of the things that had been previously built in Berlin was Hitler's bunker. Knowing that Berlin would be a target, he had a bunker built with tons and tons of concrete underground under some government buildings, and this was a place for him to run the war safely. And he went into that bunker in January, February of 1945. Very rarely emerged. The last time he comes up is on April 20th, 1945. It's his birthday, and he was awarding military medals to these soldiers who were defending the city. Now, these soldiers are very young. They're really all that's left. They're the only ones left in the city, and they're seen as these brave soldiers. After this, he goes back down into the bunker, never to emerge again. In the bunker with him, there are military leaders, there are political leaders like Joseph Goebbels and his family. There's also this lady, Eva Braun. She is Hitler's girlfriend. They've been together for many years, kind of the yin to his yang. Bubbly, outgoing, life of the party, whereas Hitler was very serious. And they decide, finally, on April 28th of 1945, to get married. They get married on the 28th, and then on the 30th, when it becomes completely clear that the Germans are losing the war, both Hitler and Eva decide to commit suicide together. How romantic. Eva takes a cyanide pill. Adolf shoots himself in the head because they would rather die than surrender. And they would have to have surrendered to the Russians. So the Russians are the ones to first get to Berlin. At this point, once Hitler is dead, the German leadership that remains, especially in the army, they start talking about surrender and coming up with some sort of peace deal. Before Hitler's death, this was not possible. He said that anyone who considered surrendering was a traitor. So now Germany can begin to try and make peace. So victory in Europe comes on May 8th, 1945. This is known as VE Day. You can see how relieved these people are. Celebrations taking place. Entire neighborhoods combining their ration cards, their ration tickets, in order to be able to make a cake and celebrate. But the war is not over. The war is still continuing in the Pacific. Britain is still fighting. America is still fighting. The issue in the Pacific definitely goes back to colonial issues. Britain has quite a number of territories, the Netherlands, and America, and France a little bit as well. But you can see that as of 1939, Japan has taken more and more territory. Some of these islands they had been given after the First World War. Some of these territories they had taken. Japan is very mountainous, not very good for farming. So one reason why the Japanese decided that they needed to take over parts of China. This colonial past not only does it have to do with what territories Japan has, but think back to our imperialism unit. Matthew Perry, the American who forces Japan open to trade with the West. So there's a little bit of animosity there. This is a European class, so we won't spend much time on the Pacific. We'll just go over some of the major battles. The turning point is in 1942 with the Battle of Midway, and a lot of the fighting is going to be between American and Japanese forces. Midway, very strategic location. You can guess from the name. It is Midway. There's Hawaii. In blue, there is Midway. It is midway between North America and Asia. And this is important because this part of the war could not be fought like it was in North Africa or Europe. You couldn't just have a whole bunch of tanks and gradually take territory. You need these islands. You need more and more islands to get progressively closer and closer to Japan. And this tactic was called island hopping. The Americans, rather than trying to invade and have complete amphibious assaults, they discovered that this was very costly, so instead they would use planes and air power to try and defeat the Japanese. This is important because rather than fighting hand-to-hand combat, this is why they use island hopping. Japan, by this point, it was clear they were very cruel. Part of this is sort of that samurai mentality of never surrendering, but it was seen even earlier than these battles in the Pacific. In 1937, when Japan started taking Chinese territory in 1936, they had said that they are racially superior to the Chinese, that they must have these territories. And in 1937, we have an event called the Rape of Nanking. Now, not only is the territory obliterated, but the people are. Depending on who you ask, they'll say that the number killed is anywhere between 40,000 and 300,000. Regardless, hundreds of thousands of people killed, specifically women and children raped. Pregnant women have their bellies sliced open by the Japanese. So the Japanese are really cruel, not just to civilians. You can see here, I mean, this soldier looks very proud of what he has done. But the Japanese are also cruel to soldiers. There are many prisoner of war camps or POW camps. For those of you who read or watched Unbroken, you saw a bit of this. And the Allies wanted to try and put an end to this war as swiftly as possible to help free the prisoners of war and the civilians that were under Japanese control. Here is the body count. Nearly 60 million people killed as a result of this war. This was definitely a world war in terms of the territories where it was fought, the countries represented, the people who were killed. This war really demonstrates the power of modern science, either for good or for evil. So why did we win? First of all, the Allies were able to produce more. This is both from the Soviet Union and the United States. We have the Americans who start producing in the 1930s, who are selling and then lending products to Britain, and that's possible because America's not involved in war, so they can be producing things. And then as a result of Stalin's 5-year plans, that this massive production gave the Allies more supplies. Then we have the entry of the U.S. as of December 7th, 1941. The British had been fighting for 2 years by that point, and they needed more help, more than just economic or supplies. They needed manpower, and the Americans provide that. Now, that's not to say that you should tell someone who is British, you're welcome. I would not suggest that. While our entry in the war was a very important element, we cannot forget the work that had been done by the British, that their country had been under attack constantly for years, and the sacrifices that the British people made. We also have all of the weapons that are developed or improved upon, the use of radar, which will be important from here on out, the way planes were adapted either for dogfighting or for bombing, all of these different variations, and then of course the atomic weapons. As this war is coming to a close, the Allies need to decide what will happen next. So the first major instance of this is at Yalta. It's a Crimean resort town. And we have Britain, America, and the Soviet Union represented. So Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Stalin. One of the biggest things they decide is what to do with Germany. By February 45, it was very clear that Germany would lose. It was just a matter of time. Now, they could take a page from the Treaty of Versailles and take away territory, force them to pay reparations, punish them. But as they saw, that did not work, and that caused war. So Germany is allowed to stay Germany. Germany keeps its borders, and it will just be occupied and sort of babysat by these allied nations. So here we can see the territories. And still in that pink, those areas that will be controlled by the U.S., we still have a number of American air bases and military outposts. The other issue is that the British and Americans asked Stalin, if the war lasts much longer, would Stalin get involved in the Pacific? Stalin absolutely did not want to. He felt that he had done his part. He had disabled the Germans enough in the Eastern Front in the Battle of Stalingrad that he didn't need to sacrifice anymore. Then, once the war in Europe is done, they need to come up with a few more specifics. So they do that at Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin. Same countries, but different people. We'll start with America. President Franklin Roosevelt had died. He had been ill for quite some time. And so his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. We still have Stalin. And then we have Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister. When the war was over, Britain holds elections, as they hadn't for so long because of the war. Churchill, the man who had led the British people through the war, through a few harsh policies, rationing, sort of that sense of the stiff upper lip that the British have. He looked to a future after the war where the people would pull themselves up by the bootstraps. The British people were exhausted and they wanted more help from the government. They wanted more services provided. And that's what Clement Attlee's party offered. So the man who led Britain through the war is not re-elected, and Clement Attlee takes his place. The biggest thing decided at the Potsdam Conference is what to do with Berlin. We've talked about the capital cities being very symbolic. Berlin is in the heart of the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, but they decide to divide the city itself just because it is so symbolic. And we see here East and West Berlin. All of this will lead to some of our topics in the Cold War. The other major thing is Stalin is rewarded with Eastern Europe. Remember, he argued that his disabling of Germany at Stalingrad and on the Eastern Front was so significant that the Allies would not have won the war without Stalin's efforts. And his consolation prize, his goodie bag, is this territory. Now we look at all of this, these territories that had been controlled and conquered by the Nazis, now conquered and controlled by another dictator. Now why would the Allies do this? Why would they agree to this? Well, even though Russia, Britain, and America were allies, they were truly frenemies. Britain and America had no love for Stalin, but at the time, they all had a common enemy in Hitler. Now that Germany has been eliminated, there is tension between the Soviet Union and the West. So rather than fight each other, they agree to this compromise, and it will take us directly into the Cold War.